Tourcoing, northern France, 9:15 in the evening, June 5, 1944. In a concrete bunker buried beneath a suburban street, 30 men sit hunched over radio receivers, headphones clamped tight, pencils hovering above notepads. The air smells of valve heat and cigarette smoke. Outside, the town goes about its ordinary wartime evening, utterly unaware that the fate of the war in the West is about to pass through this room. A dial crackles. A French voice, calm and unhurried, begins reading out a list of sentences that mean nothing to anyone except the handful of people they are intended for. Most are nonsense. Then comes a phrase that one officer in this room has been waiting 5 months to hear. Blessent mon coeur d'une langueur monotone. 6 words of 19th-century French poetry, broadcast from London. And the officer listening knows exactly what they mean. He does not know the date. He does not know the beaches. But he knows with total certainty that within 48 hours the largest seaborne invasion in human history is going to begin. This is the story of a signal that was never meant to be a secret weapon at all, and yet became one of the most consequential pieces of communication in the Second World War. It was not built in a laboratory. It was not forged from steel or wired with valves. It was a poem, chosen almost on a whim, turned into a switch that could set 2 great armies in motion. And the astonishing thing is that the Germans heard it, understood it, believed it, and still could not stop what came next. Why a war of tanks, radar, and code-breaking machines should turn, at its most critical hour, on 6 lines of verse by a long-dead French symbolist is a question worth sitting with. Because the answer says as much about the limits of intelligence as it does about the ingenuity of deception. By the spring of 1944, the Allies faced a problem that no amount of firepower could solve on its own. Operation Overlord depended on landing several 100,000 men on a heavily defended coastline, and it could only succeed if the Germans did not know when or where the blow would fall. The difficulty was not simply keeping the invasion secret. Everybody on both sides of the channel understood that an invasion was coming eventually. The question was timing and location, and that question had to be answered not just for Allied planners, but for an entirely different audience across the water in occupied France. The French resistance was not one organization but hundreds of scattered networks, each with its own leadership, its own methods, and often no contact with the others at all. Some were communist-led, some royalist, some run directly by London's Special Operations Executive, and many operated in near-total isolation, cut off by the constant risk of infiltration and betrayal. For the invasion to succeed, these networks needed to carry out sabotage at a precise moment, cutting railway lines, severing telephone cables, blocking roads, so that German reinforcements could not reach Normandy in time to throw the landings back into the sea. If the sabotage began too early, the Germans would repair the damage and tighten security long before the real invasion arrived. If it began too late, panzer divisions would already be rolling towards the beachheads while the first landing craft were still hitting the sand. There was no way to send individual couriers to every resistance cell in France with a synchronized start date. Radio operators working for the networks were being captured and shot at an alarming rate. The average life expectancy of an SOE wireless operator in the field in 1943 has been estimated at only a few months. Direct written orders could be intercepted, and any single method of secret communication, however clever, was vulnerable to compromise the moment one operative talked under interrogation. The Gestapo and the Abwehr had already demonstrated in the Netherlands and elsewhere just how thoroughly a single captured transmitter could be turned against its own network, feeding false reassurance back to London for months while the operator behind the key sat in a cell. Any scheme built around named agents, fixed transmitters, or individually distributed orders carried the same fatal weakness. It could be unpicked, one arrest at a time, until the whole structure collapsed. What the Allies needed was something altogether different in character. It had to be a channel that could reach every network simultaneously, whether that network held 1 member or 200, It had to require no equipment beyond an ordinary domestic wireless set, the kind already sitting, often illegally retained under occupation law, in farmhouse kitchens and shopkeepers' back rooms across France, and it had to be verifiable by anyone listening, resistance member or German officer alike, without the broadcast itself, giving away who was meant to act on it or what action they were meant to take. Put simply, the Allies needed to hide their instructions not behind a locked door but in plain sight, broadcast openly to millions, so that intercepting the message and understanding its purpose became two entirely separate problems. The solution already existed, in a modest form, broadcasting nightly from London. Since 1940, the BBC's French service, Radio Londres, had carried a program called Les Français parlent aux Français. The French speak to the French. Tucked within its nightly output was a segment of what were blandly called messages personnels, personal messages, ostensibly greetings and reassurances sent to families and friends across the channel. In reality, a growing number of these lines were prearranged codes, agreed in advance between SOE case officers in London and specific resistance circuits in the field. A phrase as mundane as "the cow jumped over the moon" might mean nothing to 99 listeners and everything to the 100th, who had been told weeks earlier that this exact sentence, read aloud on the wireless, meant proceed with the plan. By 1944, the nightly list of messages personnels had grown so long, and the ordinary tone of the announcer's voice so unchanging, that a German intelligence officer listening in could hear dozens of coded instructions pass by without any means of knowing which, if any, mattered. The particular signal chosen for the invasion itself was assembled at SOE headquarters and drew, almost by chance, on a poem by Paul Verlaine, Chanson d'automne, written in 1866, long before wireless telegraphy existed and further still from any thought of war. Its opening lines, describing the long sobbing of autumn violins, had already been used by at least one resistance circuit the previous year as a standby signal. For the invasion, two passages from the same poem were repurposed. The first three lines, broadcast on the 1st of June, told the resistance networks that the invasion would come within roughly 2 weeks and that sabotage teams should move to readiness. The second stanza, held back and transmitted only when Allied commanders were confident the landings were imminent, was the true trigger. It told the networks the invasion would begin within 48 hours and that railway sabotage should start at once. What made this system work was not cryptographic complexity, but its opposite. There was no machine to break, no cipher to crack, because there was nothing encoded in the conventional sense at all. The words themselves were the entirety of the message, memorized weeks or months in advance by resistance leaders who had been told, through a courier or a face-to-face briefing, which lines to listen for and what they meant. A German signals unit could record every syllable of the broadcast, transcribe it perfectly, and still learn nothing, because the meaning existed only in the minds of people already listening for it. It is roughly the communications equivalent of a spoken password. Overhearing the word tells you nothing unless you already know what door it opens. This stood in stark contrast to the machine-based secrecy that dominated the rest of the war's intelligence effort. The German Enigma machine and the Allied code-breaking effort against it at Bletchley Park depended on immensely complicated mechanical substitution, dozens of rotor settings and plugboard combinations that had to be reconstructed mathematically before a single word of the underlying message could be read. The Verlaine broadcasts required no equivalent machinery on either end. London needed nothing more than a studio microphone and a transmitter already carrying the nightly Radio Londres schedule. The resistance needed nothing more than an ordinary domestic wireless receiver, often no larger than a modern bread box, tuned to a frequency millions of French households already knew by heart. The entire apparatus of this deception rode on infrastructure that had existed, openly and legally, since long before the war. The messages personnels themselves had grown by the spring of 1944 into a nightly ritual lasting several minutes, sometimes stretching to 30 or more individual phrases read out one after another in the same measured, unhurried tone regardless of what each one meant. Some genuinely were personal greetings, included to preserve the illusion that the whole segment was harmless. Others carried instructions for a single circuit to collect an arms drop, or to expect a courier, or to lie low because of suspected infiltration. Compiling this list each evening required close coordination between the BBC's French service, which controlled the airtime, and SOE's country sections in London, which held the master list of phrases agreed with circuits in the field, sometimes negotiated during an agent's brief and dangerous return visit to Britain, sometimes passed along a chain of couriers over weeks. Precisely how many separate codes were active by June 1944 is not fully documented in surviving archives, and estimates offered by historians vary considerably, but the nightly broadcast is understood to have carried dozens of live instructions embedded among what sounded, to any ordinary listener, like a rambling list of family news. The broadcasts were prepared and read from BBC studios in London, drawing on lists compiled jointly by the BBC's French service and SOE liaison officers, who each evening added the specific phrases requested by circuits in the field to the general nightly bulletin. The reading itself required no special equipment beyond a microphone and a transmitter already broadcasting nightly to millions of French listeners. The entire apparatus of deception rode on infrastructure that had existed since the fall of France. Its output could be picked up on almost any household wireless set still in occupied territory, smuggled batteries and hidden aerials notwithstanding, which meant the reception end of this system was already sitting, ready and waiting, in farmhouses and backrooms across the country. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. On the night of the 1st of June 1944, German listening posts along the invasion coast picked up the opening lines of the Verlaine poem exactly as the resistance did. This was no accident of poor security. The Germans had known about the significance of these specific verses since January, after French collaborators had revealed details of the code to their handlers. Lieutenant Colonel Helmuth Meyer, the senior intelligence officer of the German 15th Army stationed in the Pas-de-Calais, had been briefed months earlier by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris himself on exactly what these lines from Verlaine would mean if broadcast. When Meyer's own 30-strong monitoring team caught the first stanza on the 1st of June, he immediately reported it up his chain of command, and the 15th Army was placed on a heightened state of alert. 4 days later, at 9:15 in the evening on the 5th of June, the same monitoring post caught the second stanza, the true 48-hour warning. Meyer again passed the alert upward, and this time it reached as far as headquarters of German forces in the west. And here the story takes its strangest turn. Despite receiving what amounted to advance warning of the invasion, delivered by the enemy's own broadcast and correctly decoded by German intelligence, the alert was acted upon only partially. The 15th Army, garrisoned around the Pas-de-Calais, went to heightened readiness. The 7th Army, which actually held the Normandy coastline where the landings would fall, was in several key sectors never properly alerted at all. Many senior commanders, including Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, were away from their posts that night, and a substantial number of officers dismissed the intercept as unconvincing, or assumed the true landing would come further north, near Calais, where the coastline offered a shorter channel crossing and where Allied deception efforts under Operation Fortitude had spent months manufacturing the illusion of a phantom army poised to strike. Across occupied France, resistance networks who caught the same broadcast responded with rather more unity of purpose. Circuits associated with the ventriloquist network, operating south of Orléans, and dozens of others scattered from Brittany to the Rhone Valley moved into action through the night, cutting rail lines, felling telegraph poles, and blocking roads that German reinforcements would need to reach Normandy. The full material effect of this sabotage on German troop movements in the days immediately following the 6th of June remains difficult to quantify with precision. Allied post-war assessments varied in how much delay they attributed to resistance action against the alternative explanations of Allied air interdiction and the general chaos of the invasion itself. What is not in doubt is the psychological jolt experienced within German command structures that had believed, correctly, that they possessed advance warning, only to watch that warning dissipate through a chain of skepticism, poor coordination, and misplaced confidence in Calais as the true target. It is worth comparing this episode with German efforts at similar deception and signals discipline during the same period, because the contrast is instructive. German intelligence had, by 1944, thoroughly compromised several SOE and resistance networks in the Netherlands through the notorious Englandspiel, in which captured wireless operators were forced to keep transmitting under German control, feeding false information back to London for months without detection, and leading directly to the capture or death of dozens of agents parachuted into what they believed was friendly territory. That operation showed the Germans were entirely capable of running sophisticated deception of their own, and it stands as one of the great intelligence disasters suffered by the Allies during the war. Yet, where the British scheme in France succeeded was in its redundancy and its deliberate simplicity. Because the invasion signal depended on no single operator, no single transmitter, and no single circuit, compromising one node did nothing to unravel the whole. A captured wireless set in the Netherlands could not tell the Gestapo what the Verlaine stanzas meant to a resistance cell near Orléans, because that knowledge had never touched a transmitter at all. It existed only in a courier's memory and a network leader's mind. American planners, working through the Office of Strategic Services, ran comparable message systems for their own liaison networks in France, coordinating closely with SOE and sharing many of the same broadcast facilities. But the American effort never carried quite the same scale or the same reliance on a single shared national broadcast, reaching an entire underground movement at once. The German equivalent, insofar as one existed, lay not in matching the Allied broadcast system, but in the vast web of deception the Abwehr and Sicherheitsdienst ran through turned agents and double-crossed networks, an approach built on control and coercion rather than open broadcast, and one that, whatever its short-term successes in the Netherlands, could never scale to reach an entire national resistance movement the way a single BBC transmission could. The genius, such as it was, lay in choosing an instrument, the ordinary household wireless, that was already sitting in hundreds of thousands of homes, and a message so literary and unremarkable that intercepting it told you nothing unless someone had already whispered its meaning in your ear weeks before. The legacy of the Verlaine broadcast has become tangled over the decades with a good deal of cinematic embellishment. The 1962 film The Longest Day dramatized the moment with theatrical flourish, and in doing so cemented certain details in popular memory that professional historians have since queried, including the precise wording of the second stanza, which several French sources render with the word berçant, meaning to lull or cradle, rather than the more dramatic Blessent, meaning to wound, that appears in the film and in many popular retellings. Which version was actually read out on the night remains disputed among historians working from surviving BBC archives and German transcripts, a reminder that even a moment as pivotal as this one has not entirely escaped the fog that surrounds so much of the war's hidden history. What can be said with confidence is that the broadcast happened, that German intelligence caught it and understood its significance, and that this correct interpretation still failed to produce a coordinated German response in time to matter. The site of the German interception, the bunker at Tourcoing where Meyer's team sat that June evening, still stands today and has been preserved as a small museum dedicated to the episode, one of the few places where visitors can stand in the actual room where the warning was received. It is a strange kind of monument, not to a weapon, not to a battle, but to a piece of poetry that briefly became the most important sentence in the war, and to the peculiar fact that even perfect intelligence, correctly gathered and correctly understood, can still be squandered by hesitation, disbelief, and the human tendency to trust what one expects over what one is told. Return for a moment to that bunker on the evening of the 5th of June. The headphones, the pencils, the ordinary announcer's voice reading out a list of sentences that meant nothing to almost everyone listening. Somewhere in Normandy, resistance fighters were already moving towards railway lines they had scouted for weeks. Somewhere off the English coast, the largest invasion fleet ever assembled was forming up in the darkness. And in that bunker, an intelligence officer who had done everything right, who had listened, understood, and reported exactly what the enemy intended him to hear, watched his warning travel up the chain of command and quietly lose its urgency along the way. The Allies had built no cipher machine for this signal, no code that needed breaking, because they had built something far harder to defend against. A message that told the truth to the people who already knew what it meant and told nothing at all to everyone else, even when everyone else was listening. 6 lines of Verlaine, unchanged since 1866, became for one evening in June 1944 the closest thing the war produced to a starting gun that both sides could hear and only one side could use. That is the strange, quiet triumph at the heart of this story. Not a weapon that Hitler's forces failed to detect, but a signal they detected perfectly, and still could not stop.